Hello, welcome to CrossCurrents, produced by the City of Fort Collins in cooperation with the Larimer County League of Women Voters. I'm Barbara Rutstein, the moderator of today's program. Our topic is, are Americans getting the news they need? The way Americans get their news has changed drastically over the last 25 years. Some people long for the days of Walter Cronkite, Huntley Brinkley, or Dan Rather. Others mourn the passing of big city dailies like the Rocky Mountain News, local weeklies, or more complete coverage by their local newspaper. Now many people here have given up their daily newspaper in favor of National Public Radio, cable television like MSNBC or Fox Network, as well as the internet and various blogs. There is concern that what passes for news in some of these venues is more opinion than objective coverage of daily events and important public issues. It often appears that issues are covered in a sensational or exaggerated fashion to gain audience, and objective and fair treatment of important issues is glossed over. Why should this matter if we believe in free speech and freedom of the press? Many people believe our democratic system depends on fair and factual treatment of important issues. How else can citizens be educated on the complexity of important issues and try to make reasoned opinions based on fact if the information they are using is not objective and maybe not even factual? We have a panel who will explore various facets of the delivery of news today and how we got here. On my right is James Landers, Associate Professor from the Department of Journalism and Technical Communications at Colorado State University. On his right is Josh Johnson, Public Relations Manager for A-Train Marketing Communications. And on his right is Laura Frank, Director of iNews. Welcome to you and to our viewing and studio audiences. Let's begin with a general overview from Jim. As a professor, you've been in this business a while, and let's hear what's happened to news delivery over the last few years.
Certainly. 25 years ago, I was in newspapers, and in most communities, about 70% of the people who lived in that community read a newspaper regularly. That didn't mean every day, but 3 or 4 days a week. That figure now is down to about 40%. 25 years ago, half or slightly more people watched network television news. That figure's down to about 20%. So the audience has been drifting away from mainstream traditional news sources. They've just been going elsewhere. In this country, we have 11,000 to 12,000 magazines. People get information of all sorts from there about what interests them. We have different kinds of outlets on cable. So things have diffused, and there's more choices now for people. So the mainstream media is definitely reaching fewer than it used to.
Okay, and Laura, as a reporter of the now defunct Rocky Mountain News, what's your perspective on this?
Well, I'm one of those people that think that newspapers are the best place to get your information, but you were asking about the way that people get news, and it's true that the readership of newspapers has gone down, but really we're in such an ironic kind of situation here because technology actually allows us to get more news to more people than ever before. The problem is that we are having trouble figuring out how to create that original content to get it out to people. So that's where the gap is. That's
and
where
what
it
do you
comes
mean
in.
by creating original content?
Well, the many things that you would look at on the internet or on cable news or network or radio originated with someone else doing the reporting. And what we're seeing a lot of now is people sort of regurgitating what has been already reported and then commenting on it. So much of the news that people are exposed to these days is actually the commentary and the original reporting, the on-the-ground, first-person investigative reporting is not happening as much. We're struggling to figure out ways to pay for that.
Okay. Could the Rocky Mountain News have done things differently and survived, do you think?
Well, that's the question everyone has asked since about this time last year when it shut down. The Rocky Mountain News was owned by a corporation that had no debt, was quite diversified. We thought that the company was in very good shape and would be able to weather the economic downturn. The other newspaper in town, the Denver Post, was owned by a company that had quite a lot of debt. And so we thought if anyone was in jeopardy, it was probably the Post. But as it turned out, our owners decided that being in a metro market, which is really where the difficulty has come for maintaining the level of income, the level of return on investment, has really been a problem in the metro markets. And the company that owned the Rocky Mountain News decided it did not want to be in a metro market anymore. Most of their other properties are in non-metro markets. And so...
That means smaller communities?
Exactly.
Okay.
With less competition.
I see.
What people may not realize, if you talk about return on investment, what kind of profit a newspaper makes, grocery stores make about 3% return on investment on average. Banks, I guess depending on the bank nowadays, but banks usually make maybe 1% or 2% profit. Newspapers have been making 20% or 30%. I've worked for newspapers that were making 40% profit. How many of us would like to have an investment that would make 40% profit? How many of us would like to have an investment that made 10? And how many would like to just have an investment right now? That is never going to return for the metro market because there's too much competition. And really what we're talking about here is a sea change in the advertising model that supported reporting. Because what newspapers have always been selling is actually the access to their readers. And we were selling that to the advertisers who wanted access to those readers to sell their products. And that has completely changed.
Okay, Josh, do you have a different perspective?
I don't know that my perspective varies greatly from what Laura said, but I do question the viability of newspapers in the medium, that being print. I think that news will be there, and the types of stories that we've traditionally read in newspapers will still be produced. How we receive them, I think, going into the future is going to be vastly different. I found a statistic today that said 19% of people aged 18 to 34 look at a daily newspaper, and that the average age of a daily newspaper reader is 55 and rising. So the medium of it is very costly. You have to, make the paper, and then the ink, and then the distribution model, where there are newer ways of doing that in terms of new media, whether that's your computer or your handheld device. For instance, Google has a Google Reader that's an RSS feed where the people that are producing the actual content get fed into one space, no matter whether it's coming from varied sources. But then Google's the one profiting from it. So the people that are actually producing it aren't getting the money back. And
Do they get anything?
No, didn't they come up with an agreement to get a percentage? Or Google advertises on their websites now?
There are lots of models. There's actually something new that's come up. Everyone keeps talking about Google and Google getting all of the benefit of other people's work. Now the Associated Press has decided that it's going to try to out-Google Google and really go around Google and try to figure out a way to get news directly to people. There are lots of things going on out there now. Everyone's sort of scrambling to try to figure out where is the technology going and how can we take advantage of that. What concerns me is that while we're figuring all of this out, we're really in a news gap. So there are stories right now that we as citizens are not learning about because the coverage isn't happening. What's happened here in Colorado and really across the nation, newsrooms are half the size they once were in many cases. So imagine, no matter what industry you're in, if suddenly half your coworkers were gone, how would you maintain the quality of whatever it was you were doing? And it's no different in newsrooms. So that's what I really worry about right now. How do we bridge this gap?
Okay, yes.
And I think that that's going to have to happen, because if it's Google making the money or if it's Facebook making the money, because that's where it's going now. On Tuesday, Washington Post launched a network news Did you see that? It's the Washington Post website is going to be aligned and integrated with Facebook, so that's where the actual vehicle for the news is. But if the content isn't there, it doesn't matter. So there's going to have to be some sort of model where the people that are actually producing the content get paid,
I see.
no matter
Okay.
what the medium is.
Okay, well now how does that fit into an economic model for a newspaper? They just,
Well, part of the problem is being around younger people all the time. They don't expect to pay for information, basically, particularly news, but their general attitude is it should all be free. And so if your consumer is not willing to pay a portion of the cost, now news has always been, not always, but for at least 100 years has been primarily advertising supported. Most of the money has come from advertisers. As Laura mentioned, you're kind of selling your readership to advertisers. Well, readers did support, to a certain degree, the cost of the paper, the cost of delivering it to you. As we change to digital delivery, you still have the cost of the news gatherers. Those people need to be paid a salary, a livable salary, wage. We hope you can provide benefits for them. We hope that it becomes an industry that will attract bright and interested and people who want society to be aware of everything that's going on in it, but that takes money, and if 20%, 25% of the revenue you need is not coming from readers, from consumers, that's a very serious issue, particularly because the web has split everything up. As you know, there are millions of sites, and you need a certain volume of people connecting to your site, visiting it, accessing it, to get money from that site. And the numbers are frightening in terms of how many people must access your site on a given day for you to make any money. So
I don't understand how that works. What do you mean by that?
Basically, most websites are paid per 1,000 visitors, and that rate may vary depending on what it is.
You mean the advertiser pays the?
Yes. And
Okay.
so you may your site may receive $1.50 for each 1,000 people who visit your site. So you can do the math and realize that you would need hundreds of thousands of visitors to support some kind of news staff every day.
Okay, so I'm thinking about Facebook and some of these other sites, and I bet I access them once in 6 months, maybe, so they're not going to make any money from me. So we're assuming that other people are accessing all these various sites all the time.
Facebook currently has 120 million users in America.
Okay, and they must be all younger than I am.
And it's
I think if it were a country, wouldn't it be the third largest country
That's
in the
just
world?
in America,
But-
and the greatest percentage, I think it's like 60% are actually outside of America of people that are viewing Facebook. And there's some statistic that says that of the people that are currently on the internet, something like 90% are on Facebook. So it's comparable to Google in terms of how often it's visited by the 120 million Americans who are on there.
I see, okay. And so what I don't understand then, is there an ad on the Facebook who would pay to do that? There are ads on the sidebar,
Yeah,
is
that's how
that it?
Facebook is their revenue comes from advertising in a similar fashion in the way newspapers.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. And I make a pointed effort of never to look at the advertising, so that it's completely wasted on me.
You're not alone. Most people who visit news sites say that they rarely, if ever, click on any advertising.
And that's
Okay.
true. That's true. But what they find is that the people then, they don't click through because they don't trust the ads and where it's going to take them. But they then, if they're interested in something, will Google search that. So the advertiser doesn't actually have to pay for, if they're paying pay per click, to still get the drive to their websites.
I see, okay. Well, I really didn't understand that.
But the thing
how
that
would
does,
work.
it sets up a system that rewards Britney Spears news over city council news. Because
Right.
thousands of people may be interested in the latest escapade of Britney Spears, probably not as many are interested in what the city council or the, name
Right.
your entity
Right.
is doing, any kind of civic coverage. So that's the real challenge for us right now, is how do we pay for that reporting that is watchdog reporting, keeping an eye on institutions of power in our society.
Okay, and so if I were a consumer and I decided I wasn't going to buy a newspaper anymore, how would I keep track of the Fort Collins City Council or the hospital board or any of those?
Well, you would hope that a local newspaper or someone else was doing it. I think the Pew Research Center did a study recently where they looked at more than 1 million blogs and social networking sites. And 80% of the links on those sites went back to what they euphemistically call legacy media, which means usually, in most cases, newspapers. So
Right.
we're all still depending on the coverage of newspapers, but the ability for newspapers to cover those stories is shrinking every year, and it's expected to keep going down.
I see, okay.
There is some hope that various experiments have been tried to set up networks of neighborhood bloggers in Fort Collins, we know that we have distinct neighborhoods. Some of them are given names. And if you would have a person who lives in that neighborhood, and they could do whatever they considered to be news, whether it was picnics or somebody has a junk yard in a car, or a junked car in the yard, they could do all these things. And people in that neighborhood would be aware of that blog and read it. And then someone at a central desk, a monitor, would see what's going on in neighborhoods around the community, and then take professional news gatherers, journalists, and say, oh, this is going on here, here, and here. We need to develop that, find out, what's causing this, why, and put together what is traditionally called news. So those kinds of models are showing up. Again, you still have the problem of how do you pay for all that. Now, I know Josh and Laura can talk about the fact that we have some nonprofit corporations interested in financing news operations. Grants are available. Whether that's a permanent solution or not, we don't know. We do live in a capitalist society, and if you have a product that people want to buy, then that's supposed to, allow you to make a profit and prosper. But then we run into this issue of people not wanting to pay.
Right,
So-
right, yeah, okay. Do you think that general advertising and commercial classified advertising will ever come back to the newspaper?
The people who study it think even after we come out of the current economic slump, that newspapers at least will not recover that advertising, that they'll still be at a level that's about a third less than they were before going in to this latest recession. So no, we don't think so. In fact, some people in the advertising industry think that the whole industry may be turned on its ear, and we may be seeing different ways of marketing to people, that there won't be mass marketing anymore. It will be more specialized, individualized marketing. So we're in the midst of chaos, but out of chaos, some really wonderful things can be created, and I think that's what Jim is referring to. After the Rocky Mountain News closed, the day the Rocky closed, I was working on a story that was supposed to run the Saturday after it closed, and there were others, and we began to talk about, well, what about all of those stories that now won't get done? And you can walk into any newsroom in this state, right here in Fort Collins, and talk to people, reporters, and I'm sure that each of them could give you a list of stories that they know of that they really want to work on and haven't had the time. I bet our audience, if we polled them, could each come up with an example of a story that really is important for citizens to know that currently isn't being told. So the idea was, how can we do the kind of in-depth public service kinds of journalism stories and pay for that, leverage all of our resources and get that done? That's how the nonprofit that I am directing now, iNews, the Rocky Mountain Investigative News Network, was born. And so the idea is that a small team of investigative reporters look at stories that the newsrooms around our state would like to do, but for whatever reason are unable to, And we do those stories and then share them. And so we reach a statewide audience on matters of statewide public importance.
Okay, and how does someone contact you? If I knew of a story in Fort Collins, would I call you and say, would you do it, or does the Coloradoan have to do that? Because they're going to pay you.
It can be both. And right now, you would just send me an email at lfrank@inewsnetwork.org, and I would respond to you. But what we're building is really a network. And so far, we're working with Rocky Mountain PBS, public radio, newspapers across the state, and some emerging media, online and mobile media outlets. And it's a two-way street. We come with stories that we know are of statewide importance, and they also have stories. There's one of our partners right now has a story that they think is very important to their community, but they know it has statewide importance, and they want to work together on it, and we're doing that.
Okay, and then who's doing the paying?
Well, right now, we're as a nonprofit, we can accept grants and donations. But that's only one of our revenue streams. We have these partnerships with other media, and eventually we hope to have an underwriting program, much like public radio or public television would be familiar with. And then the fourth is what I'm calling non-journalism products and services. So it would be teaching citizens how to access their own public records, use those records that your tax dollars have already paid for, and what's there, what you can do with it, and then how to use social and news media to spread the word about what you've learned and what you've discovered. So we're taking the kinds of skills that have really revolutionized journalism in the past 15 or so years and trying to give those skills to citizens.
Okay. Any other reactions to that?
Well, just getting back on the matter of revenue, I'm sure most everyone has heard about Craigslist. Well, Craigslist has absolutely devastated newspapers because for years, a significant amount of money came in through classified ads. If you wanted to sell a car or a sewing machine you didn't use anymore, you picked up the phone, you called the paper, and all they had to employ were a few or a dozen people to answer phones, take the information, and went straight into print, and they charged you for it. It was easy money, extremely easy money. And then Craigslist has come along, and if you would compare the pages of classified ads in Colorado and now and go back 10 or 20 years, it's just incredible, the difference. So when they lost that major revenue source, and then we have the major retailers now looking for more efficient ways to reach people. The web provides that. Cable television has for years now sold local ads as inserts. So a sporting goods store in Fort Collins might buy a minute or two on a cable channel that people who are interested in sports watches. So all those things have eaten away at the franchise that used to be newspapers.
Okay. And what about the idea of a nonprofit corporation or a trust? Some papers are still run that way, aren't they? Is the New York Times still a nonprofit, or has that been bought out?
No, they were never. They're publicly traded, one of the top 5 publicly traded newspaper companies in the country.
But they weren't always.
Maybe you're thinking, for example, there are some papers. What's the one I'm thinking of in Florida?
St. Petersburg
St. Petersburg Times
Yeah.
is a nonprofit and has been run that way for a very long time. But there are very few newspapers. There's been some discussion about in Congress about whether or not to create a new category of nonprofits that would allow newspapers and other media companies to become a sort of quasi-nonprofit corporation. That's one idea. All sorts of ideas are being thrown out there. But let me say, it's not necessarily ideal because you have the same sorts of pressures. So as a nonprofit, you're going around, and I can attest to this as the director of a nonprofit news organization. You are really very concerned about trying to make sure those dollars keep flowing in so you can keep the work going. So that's not an easy thing to do for a news organization. It was much simpler when all I had to do was focus on the story and make deadline. Now it's a much different situation for that.
Sure, and it's
We need to mention here too that we would like the public to pay for this. And after the Rocky folded, there was one attempt, if not two to start online news sites, and they asked people to send money in. And I don't know.
Those were for-profit ventures.
Mhm.
And the problem with online for-profit news right now is the advertising model doesn't support it at all, doesn't come close to supporting a news operation. That's why the approach that iNews has taken is combining earned income revenue streams with nonprofit revenue streams. And by the way, I'm not convinced that nonprofit investigative news is the answer to the future of investigative news, but I do think that it is a bridge to the future. I feel confident that we will be able to figure out new business models that will support the journalism and reporting that we as citizens need. But again, we're in a gap right now. We're missing stories right now, so we need to find something that immediately bridges this gap. And I think the nonprofit news sector is one of those bridges, a very important bridge that we can do right now immediately. Already here in Fort Collins, the Coloradan has already published one of the stories, one of the multimedia investigative packages that iNews has done, and we're able to bring in local information about CSU, for example, in the story, and it's something that works and can happen right now. So
Okay.
I'm actually a little more optimistic than maybe you would expect me to be, given what I've experienced in the last year in journalism. But I'm actually quite optimistic about the possibilities of what we can build now.
Well, good. Josh, you're obviously someone who uses the computer a lot to get information. Do you think that people how they get their news affects what they believe on important issues?
No, I don't put as much value into the medium you're receiving the information from, whether it's a device or whether it's a piece of paper. But I do think that there's a lot less rigorous journalism that happens on the web. And when you read somebody's blog, even if they're taking a tone that may sound familiar to the tone you would read in a newspaper, there isn't a level of fact-checking. There isn't, when you're associated with an organization, there's a reputation with that organization. So if you're working for the Coloradoan and you mess something up, it fares badly for the organization. If you're a lone person out there covering, it's not going to fare badly for you at all. So you get a lot of rumors. The online media will put a story up much quicker before they've actually verified it. So I don't know if it affects your opinion as much, but you should definitely be more cautious. But then I was also, the Project for Excellence in Journalism says that less than 1 in 5 people believe what they read in print. So you got to wonder if they're believing what's online or if they're believing anything anymore. I think that the public trust for media, which perhaps mirrors the public trust for government, it's a chicken and egg thing there, has deteriorated as well, and that has to play into the revenue issue behind all this as well.
And I would add also that 70% of people feel overwhelmed by the amount of information that they're getting, and slightly more than that, 72% feel like the information they're getting is biased. Now, that's an interesting number to me. Then I go and look at the audiences, as Jim was alluding to earlier, and the revenue. The only legacy media that hasn't been suffering right now is cable news. Somewhat suffering in audience in some cases, others growing, but the advertising revenue has been increasing ever so slightly, but compared to everyone else, where the bottom has been dropping out. So that's MSNBC, Fox, and CNN, basically. And again, what you're getting a lot of on those cable networks is commentary, not original reporting. So I have to believe that there's some sort of connection between the feeling of being overwhelmed and confused and concerned about bias and the kind of news that people are being exposed to, not only from cable, but also from online as well.
Okay, let's see if we have any questions in our audience. Any questions? Okay, then we'll go on. If you have a question, just raise your hand. Okay.
I would add, if you
Yes,
don't
go
mind,
ahead.
one thing to add to that. What's happening, it's not just, I don't want to exclude the legacy media from culpability here. When we cut our newsrooms in half, that meant that there were fewer people to make sure that we could get the morning paper or the evening newscast or the hourly web update out there. So what happens in the news ecosystem is that the very first report of something is what gets shot out on the internet. And usually those first reports are very dependent on what officials, the news makers, are saying. So the news that you're getting is not as much the vetted and investigated and reported news that you've been used to in the past. It's more the immediate reaction and somebody else's spin. And I think we're feeling that.
Okay. And what do you tell your students?
Well, read information from a variety of sources, and you will get different opinions, and you'll also come across different facts. People misunderstand information, they don't interpret it correctly, so you may get a different perspective. You will get a different perspective if you read 3 or 4 different news sources or information sites. And I think they understand. They're a pretty skeptical bunch. Young people today don't believe in much of anything. So, they're pretty aware of a lot of what's going on and manipulation. So I think they're savvy when they pull information from the web. And that too comes with age in terms of being able to think about things more, take more time to react, being more concerned about the news. So I think they'll be fine as things go along and the web becomes the dominant source of information, however it's going to get it. So.
I think we do have a question. If you would ask your question and identify yourself, please.
All right, I'm Linda Mahan, and I want to direct this a little bit following up on what Jim has said. So I'm curious, you've been teaching at CSU for some time. How has the skill set, the attitudes, the knowledge that you try to give to your students changed, or how is it changing for the future that they face to get a job?
All right. Well, Josh can address that too. He's met with students on numerous occasions, and I've been at CSU 9 years. Very few students are interested in news, going into news. A lot of them want to be travel writers. They want to cover entertainment, music, sports is big. So what we used to consider to be traditional news attracts the interest of very, very few people. You just don't see it. As to whether they're news consumers, they're pretty busy people. The classes they take, many of them have part-time jobs. So their day's pretty full, plus at that age you want to socialize. I mean, your personal life is extremely important. So they're not really what I would call avid news consumers. Very few of them are. Most of them aren't. Whether they grow into that, see, that's part of the thing I guess that bothers me is when I was in college and got out, we all knew that young adults didn't read newspapers much back then either, but we were told you'd grow into it, that when you were in your 30s and you had a family and kids were going to school, well, that started to stop happening. I mean, there are a lot of people in their 40s and 50s now who don't read newspapers and have never really been regular newspaper readers. So it's a growing problem from my perspective, is the fact that news doesn't have as much of a following as it used to, as much relevance. So that's a problem.
Well, now, if they're interested in sports and music and all of that, what is their venue? A blog? How are they going to get a job and write about music? Are there blogs or magazines or something that just does music?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Because it would seem to me that those are the things that we're missing. I mean, when you open the newspaper on the culture page, you see music, movies, plays, books, all those kinds of things.
But the web, you can pull what you want. And it's always there. So
and they can get paid for it.
No. But right now they're willing to work for free. I mean, they are. They getting paid to them. They would like to have a full-time job, but they're aware that that may not happen. So just the excitement of doing it is enough for them right now.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And what about public discourse? Do you think that's changed because of the way people get the news? Fox News, MSNBC, do they affect politics and how people have responded to issues? I mean, we know what's gone on with health care. How much of that information was good information? Now we're going to talk about regulation of Wall Street. Is that going to be good and accurate? How do you think political news is coming out?
If I could provide the historical perspective, the United States has always had a nasty streak in political commentary. You go back to the founding of the Republic when newspapers were subsidized by political parties. And name-calling has been a tradition of American politics forever. George Washington was called a monarchist. John Adams was called a tyrant who wanted to marry his son to the daughter of a British king. Abraham Lincoln in the middle of the Civil War was referred to as a gorilla because of the way he was unusually tall and long arms. His wife was called Mad Mary because she was depressed over the death of a child. Eleanor Roosevelt, by columnist Westbrook Pegler, who worked for Hearst, called her Horseface and Empress Eleanor, and referred to Franklin Roosevelt as the cripple in the White House. So what we're seeing on the web today is
mild
nasty.
by comparison.
So the idea that we've entered into this new phase that is different because people are free to sit at a keyboard and spout whatever, that's not wrong. That's not right. We've always had that. So
I see.
that doesn't worry me.
It just is a little more offensive to some people, I guess, than others.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it may be easier to access. Maybe
Yes.
more people are seeing it in different ways, but
Uh-huh.
certainly, and I think we could think of it as a pendulum swinging. And so we were 100 years ago or more over here, as Jim has described, and maybe we're swinging back to that. But I feel like, again, we'll reach equilibrium in some way. But certainly, I think it's hard to argue that, I think everywhere you go, you hear people having discussions about, well, what about Fox News or MSNBC? And it's even the White House has gotten into the debate about MSNBC versus Fox News. I'm not sure that I'm as concerned, like Jim says, that, we've always had this. It's something we work through. I'm not sure that it's as big an issue as people say. And I think I want to believe, I hope I'm not being naive about it, that Americans are at the point where they're beginning to realize, wait a second, this is, a lot of dessert and I'm missing the meal. And I need to figure out how to get the information that is fulfilling and good and relevant and not so much of the fluff. And I think we're beginning to get to that point. And the past year or year and a half has been dramatic, especially for us here in Colorado with what's happened with our news. So I think people are beginning to recognize this is an issue. I mean, here we are talking about it this evening. I'm hopeful that people will begin to talk about ways that they want to get involved and be part of the news ecosystem rather than just a spectator.
Okay, Josh?
I guess I agree, but I guess my concern is that there is a blurring of the lines between, as we said earlier, the pundits and whether that's news or whether that's opinion. Mm-hmm. When there's a significant part of the population that say they get their news from Jon Stewart, who I enjoy,
Yes.
And then there's also a significant population that gets their news from Bill O'Reilly. When there was this sort of political mudslinging, name-calling in the past, I imagine it was on the editorial page. And you could create a clear distinction there. So you can have your opinion about the issue or the politician, and then you don't think so?
No, it was right in the news pages. It was
Really?
Yes, it was as blatant as it could be. I mean,
Yes.
Jim's the historian. He's
Well, no,
much
you're
better
right.
expert.
In the newspapers
than I am.
and Henry Luce, who ran Time Life magazine, his editors knew to manipulate, distort the news to reflect Henry Luce's viewpoint. And it was not editorials, but the selection, the placement, the adjectives. So press barons, press lords, typically most of them have used their papers and magazines like that in the past. There's evidence Rupert Murdoch's doing the same with his empire. When newspapers became corporate, beginning in the 1970s and 80s, then it became a matter of let's not be so ideological because that offends people, it puts us at risk of irritating advertisers. So that's when we began to see this blanding out of the American media in terms of, in some ways it was more beneficial because the news pages became really news and there was more of an attempt to be balanced because there was a recognition that a monopoly in most communities, certainly not Denver until last year, you had to be more responsible, that it just was not right to be overtly biased toward a political party, et cetera. So that's all relatively recent historically. So.
Okay, and what other influences has corporate ownership done to the newspapers? I mean, are the reporters then not allowed to find certain news items on certain businesses? I mean, if corporations can own lots of different things, can you find out things that you just don't want to publish?
I worked almost 20 years for corporate-owned newspapers all over the country, and I have never had an editor say to me, you can't do that story because of someone higher up. That has never happened. What did happen over and over again was the corporation said, look, we promised our shareholders 20% return, and so we've got to make cuts so that we can deliver that profit. And so what you saw in newsrooms were cuts. And you'll hear a lot of people talk about, well, what has the internet done to newspapers? Actually, it's what have newspapers done to themselves, because the decline started long before the internet was as ubiquitous as it is now. In fact, for a piece for PBS that I did this summer, I went back and looked at the top 5 publicly traded newspaper companies in this country and looked at their profits for the past 20 years. And not only in 2008, which we now know is the year of the apocalypse, journalistically speaking, not only was each of those profitable in 2008, when you adjusted their profits for inflation, in 2008, their profits were higher than their 20-year average. In other words, in the worst year since the Great Depression, they were more profitable than they'd been in the past 2 decades, which was shocking to me.
So what happened to their advertising money? They had it?
Well, they had less. Don't mistake, the advertising revenue has dropped off a cliff.
So instead of 40%, it's 20%?
Well, instead of 20%, it's 10%.
Oh, okay.
Scripps, the EW Scripps Company, which owned the Rocky Mountain News, in the year that it closed the Rocky Mountain News, made a 10% profit. But that was half what it had made in recent years.
But to achieve all this, is what Laura said, is you cut your newsroom in half. The Coloradoan shut its press unit, which threw, I think, 40-some people out of work. It's printed in Denver now. Mm-hmm. So you maintain your profits by slicing jobs, and your revenue, by the way, has continued to fall. Various companies now that are publicly traded are giving their quarterly reports, and all of them are reporting higher profits than a year ago. But then you read down to the second and third paragraph of the reports, and all of them are still have less revenue than they did last year, which was less than the year before. So they are achieving these profits by eliminating as many jobs as they can. And newspapers are more than newsrooms, of course, but it's the news that is the most visible component of it. And if the Coloradoan 20 years ago had 15 news reporters and now it has 6, well, then that obviously affects the way you can cover your community.
Right, and you can see it in the size of the paper, too.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's half the size, or maybe even less, a quarter of the size as it once was.
And that's true for it's not just here, it's everywhere.
Yes, yes. Well, the other thing that's interesting to me, because you said that some of your students want to be travel reporters, and one of the things I've noticed in the Colorado, and not so much in the Denver Post, but a lot of the travel articles are written by citizens. You know, I go on a trip and then I write it up and send it to the newspaper, and the newspaper publishes it. How do we work on that? I mean, I don't know what they pay. They probably don't pay anything, or $25.
Yeah, food, restaurant reviews are often the same sort of thing by citizens. And you're right, it's generally a a money issue. And newsrooms have found these kinds of cost savings over the years. And before, they were always in things that maybe it wouldn't be an issue if someone was a world traveler and wrote about his or her trip. That might be great. But what we haven't figured out a way to supplement until now, I hope, is how do you do the in-depth and the investigative reporting? That's really what's being cut now. And the reason it is because it's very expensive to do. So if you have a limited number of reporters and you have a story that may take a few days or a few weeks to do, you can't take someone off of the daily. You can't run blank pages in your newspaper. You have to have those filled. So that's what we really haven't figured out a good way to supplement, and that's what we're hoping that iNews can do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So that would do that for the whole state,
Exactly.
is the idea.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I'm still, I guess, concerned about getting the kinds of things I like from the newspaper, and I'm just not getting it, and I'm not ever going to sit in front of a computer all day trying to get what I can get from a newspaper in an hour. And I just don't know how people will navigate that. Do you have any suggestions? You just spend the time at it?
There's certain tools that help you do that. And like I mentioned earlier with the Google Reader as an RSS feed or Facebook.
I don't know what an
essentially,
RSS is.
It's really simple syndication. So if you read New York Times, if you read Huffington Post, if you read these various news outlets, both traditional and new, they feed into one place for you. So it's all in one place. So instead of navigating all around to find your stories, they're all there as if it was a single publication. But it's a single publication that you were the editor of, essentially. And that's sort of developing, like I had mentioned earlier, with Facebook and Washington Post announcing the network news, and New York Times has one called Times People Network, that your peers end up becoming the editors. So that when you're on Facebook and you're looking, I have friends constantly and colleagues that are posting news stories of interest to them. And they are, in effect, sort of section editors because they have a very specific interest, and I know that that's the kind of coverage they're going to do. They're not sourcing the coverage. They're finding it elsewhere and bringing it into one place for me. And the problem, of course, is that the revenue doesn't go back to the source. So what's going to happen when that source dries up, because we're all getting it this way? So this model isn't sustainable at all, really, in a similar way that the traditional models may or may not be, because of the constant issue of the revenue stream. Mm-hmm. And having gone from newspapers for 10 years into a PR role at a marketing company, we very rarely actually recommend people spend their budgets on advertising. And the reason is that advertising for today's consumer has very little credibility. They don't believe it. So in a similar way that I am using my friends as my editor and I'm becoming my own personal editor and getting my information, music reviews, book reviews, things like that, I'm going to peer-to-peer sites where people are reviewing products, where they're reviewing restaurants, and I'm making my decisions on what I'm going to purchase based on that, rather than being influenced by something I saw in a paper. So people are pulling their ad money out because there's not an obvious return on investment. They can't justify it in their marketing budgets anymore. And so any model that does come out of this, the revenue stream cannot come from advertising. And that's really been the Achilles heel of media, is that subscriptions have only supplemented, I think somebody said 20%, mm-hmm. And 20% does not carry. If the rest of your 80% is directly one, revenue source, if that revenue source goes through a natural evolution, which has happened, and is gone, you're gone. Mm-hmm. So it's really the main issue here is trying to come up with in very creative ways, and I think that a nonprofit model may help bridge that gap. But there has to be something beyond that,
yes.
Because you can't constantly be working to go back to ask people for money, and then there's there's classically been a separation in the between the newsroom and the ad team.
Yes.
But if you're a nonprofit, you still have a board of directors, you still have donors. If you do one thing that really, really upsets people, that's very controversial, and all your donors pull out, then what? It's like all your advertisers pulling out. But the difference is that advertisers had a value in giving it to you in that they were concerned with their bottom line. So even if you were controversial, that meant that your readership would go up, therefore the value of their ad dollars would go up. If you're controversial and your donors pull out, the only reason they're giving it to you is because they feel there's value in it, you know, and if they don't feel there's value any longer, they'll pull out.
Which is why iNews is working so hard on those earned income revenue streams. So when you say, I want to learn how to get the information I like, if I can't get it from my newspaper, then you could come to one of the iNews training events and learn how to get that information, Barbara.
And start a blog.
Well, it's
and then
just,
start your own blog.
yeah,
Right?
I mean, I'm just a newspaper reader, and I know that when I look at the newspaper, first of all, I read too much of it because it's interesting to me. And secondly, I'm not a scientist, but I can go through and I see some articles on science that I think are very interesting, and I learn something from them. Well, I'm never going to find that on the internet.
Yes, you
Yes,
will.
you can.
Yeah, you can.
And you can
But-
find more and more
It's
depth.
more,
We can show you
yes.
how.
Not in the same way, because I'm not going to go scrolling
Well-
through a million
you
sites.
may. So
What-
if you were on Facebook, if you were on Facebook more regularly than 6 months, and you were connected to more people with similar interests as you, that sort of information would be coming across your Facebook page. You would be seeing links on that. If you were using Twitter, you would be seeing that kind of, in fact, you could go in and search. Say you were interested in quantum physics. You could go in and do searches, simple searches on quantum physics, and find all sorts of articles, not only from newspapers, but also from scientific journals and some blogs that are really quite good and in-depth.
Oh, I know I
here's-
could find it, but what I'm saying is I can find it in the newspaper, read it in 5 minutes or
you
less,
can't
and
really.
be done.
But, as Josh mentioned at the start, the average age of a newspaper reader is 55. Well, a figure I use, the median age, which is slightly different, is 62, and it's climbing
Yes.
every year. Josh mentioned RSS. I have RSS feed set up to give me news items on tennis, because I like to play tennis, on Thailand, because it's a country that has interested me and I've been to. I used to live in Milwaukee. I've got news that gets funneled to me at all times of the day, because that's what I want. And I guarantee you, it won't be in the Coloradoan, it won't be in the New York Times. So newspapers cannot compete with that in their present form. Now they're going to have to shift. And then to the whole idea of revenue streams again, we keep coming back to this. I was at an event a little while ago from someone who's in Josh's field, and they said, we haven't used a newspaper in 5 years. You know,
Okay,
they-
I think we have a
so-
question in the audience.
Yes, I'm Jan Gilligan. I have a question for everyone. We've had a guest member of our CrossCurrents team talk to us a little bit about newspapers, and she reflected that she thinks that perhaps in the future our local newspapers perhaps will only be published 2 or 3 times a week, and then perhaps with dominant newspapers around the country and maybe only 4 or 5 of them publishing daily. I'd like each of you to speak to that if you have any opinion on that.
That's already happening, yeah, in several cities. I think that's absolutely right on.
I don't think they'll be publishing at all, quite frankly. I think,
Okay.
25 years from now, why are you going to spend the money? And I mean, you think about also the environmental fallout when we're all trying to conserve, fuel. And the amount of inputs that go into producing a newspaper it's astronomical as compared to shipping it out to a wireless device. And when you're cutting costs, that mean cutting out the print aspect of it. I mean, what percentage of your overall budget is the print aspect of it? That could be direct.
Something like 70%.
Yeah, that could be, revenue.
In 25 years, that's fine, I'll be gone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's being talked about regionally. We have student interns, students who go down and work for a newspaper or wherever to get professional experience, and then it looks good on their resume. We had an intern at the Denver Post 3 summers ago, and during a meeting with interns, the top editor said it's being discussed that the Denver Post might only publish Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday. And then breaking news would go online. And as Laura said, we already have newspapers going to non-daily publication. Sunday editions, which used to be what were called the flagships, thick with ads, largest circulation of the week, they are falling rapidly because, again, we all have many sources of information. We all have things to occupy our time, to entertain us or inform us. whichever we want, newspapers play less and less a role in our daily habits.
Okay, so in essence, you all think that Americans are getting the news they need?
Well, I'm not sure we said that.
No.
No,
I
I
don't
think we
think
talked
so
about
at
the
all.
news gap.
Okay.
There's a
Right.
news gap we're not getting. There are stories right now that we know of that aren't being reported, that need,
Okay,
that have to
so-
do with people's livelihoods and health and government. We know that we're not getting all the news we need.
Okay, so for your final comments, what would you recommend to people on how they try to get the news that they need?
Well,
That-
okay,
that-
here comes the shameless plug again.
Yes, that's all right.
Again, what iNews is trying to do is deliver that kind of news to the places you're already used to getting your news and expand out to the social media networks and emerging news sources as well. So I would encourage anyone who is interested in helping support that to contact me at lfrank@inewsnetwork.org, and I can talk with you about that. And I hope that we can have some of those training events that I was telling you about that would help people learn how to access the information that is out there, because there's so much out there, and we need to know how to get to it.
Okay, Josh, what would you recommend?
I really wish I could answer that question. I'm not sure that the information is available in a way that it should be for us to be a fully informed democracy. I think that we're definitely not in a glut of information. It is there. It's not as easy as walking up to the corner and plopping in a quarter and getting what you need to know. I think that, we have to be a lot more active in the pursuit of it. So I guess the only recommendation I would have is look for it. It's on the internet, but.
Okay. And Jim, what would you recommend for people?
Well, I think we will come to a form of subscription news. Healthcare workers, accountants, lawyers, technicians of various sorts need information about their industry. They will support news sites that give them specific information. In turn, those news sites monitor legislation, regulation. So we won't have the general news vehicles we used to have. We'll have very specific, tailored news items for people. And then what you would hope would come out of this would be someone who can gather things together, correlate information, and take it one step further. Why is this happening? What's the effect going to be on society beyond that narrow range of people who are paying for this information?
Okay, well, thank you very much. This CrossCurrents program will be rebroadcast at various times during the month on Channel 14 in Fort Collins. Please check your local listings for exact dates and times. Copies of recent CrossCurrents programs are available at the Poudre River Library District at 201 Peterson Street in Fort Collins and at Front Range Community College Library at Shields and Harmony Road. Thank you to our panelists and to our studio and viewing audiences.